start of a new month today, April 1. And I was very tempted to include some sort of April Fool's prank in today's video, but since this is serious, mature content, I will restrain myself and grow up for the next few minutes here. We're in the book of Malachi today, which is the last book in the Old Testament. We've actually been really immersed in the Second Temple portion of Old Testament history for this entire week, which is kind of cool. It's good to familiarize ourselves with parts of the Bible that we don't often go to. And Malachi is a great example of this. I don't know about you, but I've never really heard Malachi talked about in Christian circles. The only passage that I've ever really heard from Malachi is the one about tithing, right? Where God says that if you aren't tithing, you're robbing him, which makes for a very compelling passage if your church needs to raise money for something. While that passage is a good passage, I want to look at something else today in this book. So just a quick summary of the book. Malachi is different from pretty much all of the other Old Testament minor prophets, just in how it's structured. Aside from Jonah, all of the other minor prophets are basically just a message from God. It could be a vision, it could be a monologue, but the message goes one direction. It's God to the people. Well, Malachi is a message to the people too, but it's done in the form of a dialogue. God will say something to the people or accuse the people of something, and then the people will question God, and then God will respond to them. The robbing passage is a really good example of this. God says, "You're robbing me." The people say, "What? How are we robbing you?" And then God goes on to explain. This happens again and again throughout the book. God accuses the people of offering sickly animals for sacrifices, of marrying pagan women, of speaking arrogantly to him. And the people always act completely ignorant of what God is talking about. Us? What are you talking about? So the back and forth dialogue that they have, it's really interesting. You should read it sometime. Today, we're not going to look at something that God accuses the people of. This is something that I feel like we've already addressed a couple times recently. Instead, I want to take you on a little journey, starting with the opening verses of the book. A prophecy. The word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. I have loved you, says the Lord, but you ask, how have you loved us? Whoa. Now that's a pretty bold statement from the people, isn't it? They are directly questioning God's love for them. But why is it that they're doubting God's love? Well, Malachi was written after the people of Israel had returned home from exile. If you remember back to our discussion in Ezra a couple days ago, there were a series of decrees that were issued that allowed the Jewish people to return home and rebuild the temple and rebuild their way of life. So the people get back, they rebuild the temple, and everyone is stoked. I mean, there are all of these promises throughout the prophets about God coming to reign in a new temple, about the Messiah coming and setting up an eternal kingdom that will bring justice and prosperity to the people of Israel. Hooray! Well, if you read through Nehemiah, which Nehemiah actually pairs really well with Malachi. They cover a similar portion of Jewish history. If you read Nehemiah, you see that this doesn't happen. Even with the best of intentions, the sanctity of the temple and the commitment of God's people gradually become more and more compromised. And Nehemiah is not happy about this. I mean, if you just read the Old Testament, this feels like deja vu. Here we go again. And if you read through Malachi, God is not happy about this. And to top it all off, the people aren't happy either. The verse that we just read that opens up the book, God says, I have loved you. And the people go, really? How? If you loved us, well, then you would keep your promise. And that's not the only complaint that they levy against God. Later in the book, you, the people, have said it is futile to serve God. What do we gain by carrying out his requirements and going about like mourners before the Lord Almighty? But now we call the arrogant blessed. Certainly evildoers prosper, and even when they put God to the test, they get away with it. So the people aren't just doubting God's love, they're also doubting his justice. The wicked are out there prospering, yet we aren't gaining anything from following you. You could preach a whole sermon just on that phrase, what do we gain? And the entitlement that the people are feeling from being God's chosen people. But here's the picture that I'm trying to paint. The people are living in a reality that doesn't line up with their expectations. They waited for God to deliver them from exile. And then they prepared themselves for God's promised reign. But it didn't happen. And what happens as a result? Well, just think about the content of the book. God accuses the people of not being faithful to the covenant, and the people accuse God of not being loving and just. Because they're stuck waiting for God, they start slacking on God's commands, and they start doubting God's character. And these two things are temptations that you and I are faced with when we have to wait for God. We can start to doubt God's character, and we can start to slack on following him. But there's also a big picture element of waiting in the book of Malachi, because Malachi, like the rest of the Old Testament prophets, has this hope of a coming Messiah. The last half of the book looks forward to a day when God will send a prophet like Elijah who will prepare the way for the Messianic king. And the book ends on a bit of a cliffhanger, anticipating this day when God will step in and set things right. And that's it. The book ends. And so we wait. And the people have to wait 400 years before Jesus arrives. Here's what I'm getting at. I think Malachi is a valuable lesson in waiting. It records a time when people who were stuck waiting started breaking God's commands, and they started doubting God's character. And this little book stands as a challenge to the people of Israel going forward. It's going to be more than 400 years before God's promise will be fulfilled. Will they still trust and follow God, even if all they can do right now is wait? Which leads us into the question for today. How can you wait well for God? I'm sure most of you have been in a place before where you were waiting for God. Maybe you prayed for something and had to wait for an answer, or you're still waiting for an answer. Maybe you're waiting for guidance or direction or confirmation in life. Maybe it's just a matter of waiting for Jesus' return. Part of faithfulness to God involves waiting. And when I look at the book of Malachi, I see three key reminders when we have to wait for God. Be patient, be faithful, trust God. Easier said than done, right? But here's something that's actually helpful for this. Look back. Look back at the ways that God has acted in the past. Remind yourself of his goodness and his faithfulness, and then look forward to the future with hope and confidence. Let the past, whether that's the Bible or your own walk with God, inform the way that you wait in the present. Though it took 400 years in the Bible, God did fulfill his promise to his people. You might wait a very long time for God. You might wait your whole life. You might wait a long time and not get an answer that you want. But God is faithful. And with that, we are going to pick the book of the Bible that we will go to tomorrow. Maybe it's going to be another minor prophet. It is, not a minor prophet, but similar portion of history, 2 Kings. We will be in that book tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so you can keep getting these every single day.